This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and today I'm with Amelia Hadfield, Professor of Politics at the University of Surrey. Hi Amelia, thank you for giving your time to the Guildford Dragon.
Hi Martin, it's lovely to be here.
Right, so we'll get straight into it. You've overseen a report called Charting Surrey's Post-COVID Rescue, Recovery and Growth. And last night you chaired an online meeting presenting the report and discussing it. So why did you organise this report? What's its aim?
We were commissioned to put this report together. Surrey County Council about a year ago constructed a new commission called the Future Economy Surrey Commission to look in very real detail at the strengths and the weaknesses of Surrey in the most comprehensive way possible, economic, social, political, etc., from a pre-COVID perspective, I should add. And the idea at that point was to look at ways in which Surrey continued to punch above the national standard with some very standout areas, really world-leading businesses, but also really beginning to demonstrate areas of significant slide, complacency in terms of attitudes to business and perhaps sustainability, areas where responsiveness, a sense of democratic representation perhaps were simply not what they needed to be. So the idea of the commission was to commission this report. We were appointed to head this up. We were also requested to do so in deep conjunction with many other stakeholders, including local government, but local stakeholders too. So we began this report in May and June, and by that time, of course, the mandate had shifted completely because of COVID. So I went back to the commission and said, I think this report really, cannot do this without looking at the impact of COVID on Surrey. And that's what it's become, Martin. It's become an appraisal of pre-COVID characteristics in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, many which I think will outlive COVID actually, the immediate material impact of COVID, to some extent the impact of Brexit, and where Surrey as a whole, individuals, communities, businesses, and local government need to go in charting a rescue and ultimately a more medium and long-term recovery. So we launched the report last night. It's now publicly available on the website of the university, and I dare say everywhere else now as well. And the report concludes with a series of final recommendations, which have been given to the Surrey Growth Board. And it's up to them, I think, to some extent, to look at those recommendations, to focus on them, to take the ones, I hope all of them, that they want, and to work with us to continue to see those play out in Surrey.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you were commissioned to write the report, and so summarising some of the observations there, are you saying that Brexit and COVID are acting as catalysts for change in Surrey? That some of this change was building up anyway, and now it's been sped up by these events?
Yeah, I think many of the pre-COVID characteristics that we've seen in Surrey, either in terms of growth-based specific industries, specialisms, if you like, but also areas of a sort of a bleak sense that just because Surrey in some areas is affluent, it doesn't need to work as hard as other counties, and because it provides an enormous amount of the exchequer and has a cozy relationship, with national government, it somehow doesn't need to work hard. And that's simply not true, because there's massive areas of deprivation and poverty that are simply not well known about. We were very keen to dig up the data on this and to point this out to national and local government decision makers, and to say, if you want to have a sustained growth, it has to be inclusive. And it has to take into consideration the enormous impact in terms of unemployment that is going to happen as a result of COVID, and shrinkage of business, possibly as a result of Brexit. So it's full of very stark warnings, as much as it is being sort of flying the flag for Surrey in terms of where it has done well.
Okay, now in the report you say the report lists as key drivers the importance of growth, but where do you think the counter argument, because it does exist, that there are disadvantages to growth too? Do you think that's properly represented, or is the former Chancellor right when he says that we must have a pro-growth culture? Philip Hammond, I mean, where do you come on that judgment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Surrey is finding itself at this point sort of torn between two tensions. One, obviously, very real, representing very real sustainable and economic growth in many, many areas. In fact, I think competitively punching above its weight nationally and possibly even internationally as well. But at the same time, it's really beset because of the location and the sort of the tightness of the county, and the increased pressures with regards to developing those spaces, but developing them sustainably, developing them in a green-based way, and having to deal with infrastructure pressures and employment pressures as a whole. So that's a very tense context in which we started speaking to stakeholders, and almost every person, or business recognized this. I think ideally, what I try to suggest in the report is a combination of the two, a reciprocal, sustainable solution. I think we do have to prioritize a growth-first strategy, but I think it has to be done in an intelligent way. I don't think it can be done in a unilateral way. It cannot simply be an overarching sort of endless march by a couple of stakeholders, irrespective of the needs and the opinions of everybody else. So, Martin, please believe me when I say having spoken to dozens and dozens, really in the hundreds of people across the summer, the narrative of the report is insistent need that the growth is sustainable, and representative, so green growth and inclusive growth as a whole. Otherwise, we're going to wind up with a very unhappy conversation, sort of resonant of the type of conversation we've been having in Surrey thus far, with two sort of sharply divided islands on either side. I will say, I think to economically steer across the shoals of COVID and Brexit, growth in terms of increased and sustainable job opportunity and increased GVA as a whole is the only way that Surrey is going to steer through this. But at the same time, given Britain's commitments at the national level to steer towards carbon neutrality, that growth has to be done in accordance with that agenda as a whole. That's a very serious commitment.
But it is quite tricky to find the middle ground sometimes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a good thing it's the Department of Politics trying to find the middle ground in this report. I will say, I think the majority of people we spoke to were very measured, very nuanced. Everybody was willing to, understand the other side, of course. And I think what they were trying to do was find ways where they could overlap, where there were genuine complementarities, so that there was sustainable growth. I think Dunsfold Park is a lovely example. We walked with Jim McAllister. We spent a whole half afternoon down there looking at the way in which he uses sustainable growth, not just to support climate change targets, but to grow micro businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises, to work with the university, to give students a chance. So there's a whole multi sort of purpose objective to Dunsfold, which I think is a lovely microcosm. It's a lovely example, if you like, of the type of inclusive, sustainable growth that I think Surrey should use to propel itself out of COVID.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned the importance of innovation and skill to our local economy. Technology is now the biggest element of Guildford's economy. What are the factors that decide whether we will continue to attract such industry?
That's a great question. Surrey does punch above its weight. It has not just a comparative advantage, it has a competitive advantage that really puts it beyond sort of national level. So attractive areas include a highly educated workforce in the first instance, and a workforce that I think is, or pre-COVID at least, was prepared to be mobile from Surrey to London and back and forth, enjoys a Surrey quality of life, enjoys the fact that it's inclusive and sustainable growth, and I think enjoys the idea that it's part of an economic market in Surrey that has enjoyed a very strong track record. I think one thing that Surrey has seen as a result of COVID is that innovation skill now can be reworked, repurposed, everything from a repurposed high street to a repurposed method of engaging online. And the vast majority of SMEs that we've spoken to had seen the online structures as a catalyst to improved business, had allowed in some areas, some cases, to identify new partners, even partners in Europe, and to innovate in every sense. So innovation for us suddenly became quite a wide spectrum in terms of either finding new clients, improved ICT structures, identifying new markets, as well as physically working from home. And it raised questions over what the sort of topography, the business topography, if you like, of Surrey and the way it should look from 2021 onwards. And so one of our recommendations, in fact, is to look again with renewed eyes at how to innovate the high street, and to think again about what it means to sort of embrace the modern COVID workplace as a whole.
Okay, and presumably, you know, when a company or an individual is looking for a job or a place to build their business, whether the area is attractive as a place to live, it is going to be one of the factors, even if it's not high on their list of their business plan. It will be a subliminal factor, won't it?
Actually, it's very explicit. The vast majority of people we spoke to said, you know, Surrey has it's a beautiful county. It has an identity that is associated with all that is best about England and all that is best about Britain, either sort of punchy innovation, sort of entrepreneurial business attitudes, but also the green and leafy aspects. I want to be a little bit careful there, because to some extent that's a bit of an exaggeration, and it plays to the assumptions that if everything is like that across the county, and it's simply not the case. Equally, the way in which that acts as a magnet and then as an anchor to businesses, I think is extremely important, will continue to be important, and maybe one of the factors that allows Surrey to punch above other counties, frankly, in Britain, in being able to attract innovation, attract foreign direct investment, attract young and skilled families. So it's residential pulls as well as business pulls, I think, that are encapsulated in your question.
Okay,
yeah.
And presumably, therefore, it's important that we preserve that.
Absolutely.
For economic reasons.
Yeah, and I think people are very cognizant of that. I didn't get a sense that, you know, there's a sort of like Victorian approach to rolling over everything. I think the local enterprise partnerships are very mindful of that. They've all got skills and enterprise boards dedicated to making sure that small businesses survive the pandemic, and do so in a way that supports the community in a sustainable way, doesn't just kind of take a bite out of it in order to survive for the next 2 to 3 months. So I think that's a key characteristic of pre-COVID Surrey, but I reckon will be after COVID and Brexit.
Okay. Now, also mentioned in the report is the East-West gap, the difference in the economy between the east and west of the county of Surrey. How big is that? I mean, if I was a Yorkshireman, wouldn't I think, well, you know, everyone in Surrey is pretty well off?
Well, it arises from the fact that the two areas of Surrey specialize in different things. So I think there's a sense perhaps that they have their own individual particularisms. But you can also see that there is a gap in terms of overall income per capita, the productivity of the region, particularly, you know, East Surrey as a whole, and the connectivity between the two sides. And everybody from the east would, you know, would say to us, well, the west has to work harder to connect with us, and the west would say the same about the east. So I think there is a lot of data to point out that disparity is not just there, it's growing. And I think that was one of the key reasons for why the commission was set up, is to look at why that's the case. Why is the infrastructure sort of gappy there? Why are the two sides not investing in the other? Why is there a slightly siloed approach perhaps to the two? I mean, the report doesn't pretend to, you know, suggest much by way of solutions. We suggest it's an issue that needs to be looked at, and part of the solution has to accept that you know, that's the case now, and it needs to be overcome, because, as I've said before, pre-COVID gaps I think will worsen as a result of at least short-term economic declines with COVID, but could widen as a result of potential impacts with Brexit. We still looking to see whether there's a negotiation with the European Union, but doubtless we're going to see increases in terms of some areas of goods, and I think the ability of that to increase the gap east and west is important. In the report, we have a whole section dedicated to national and local data that took us the entire summer to gather. I was astonished at how little data there was. So we started, you know, discussing with people, and we did surveys of our own. And in fact, my thanks to the Chambers of Commerce, who went out of their way to allow us to talk east and west to the small and medium-sized enterprises in both of those, to give us a very clear read, a forensic read, I think, on the disparity between the two. It's a problem, and it needs to be solved.
Okay, but is it a big step between the two, or is it a relatively small step compared with, say, Surrey and the north of England?
No, I think it is a big step. I think anything that where there's a separation of more than 15%, if
Okay.
you like, in terms of income or GVA, it suggests an unevenness, and it suggests that Surrey as a whole, can't operate uniformly. It also suggests that people who speak for Surrey actually aren't that representative, because they're trying to come up with a uniform whole that actually doesn't tell you much about that difference.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned COVID and the pandemic. How much damage has that done to Surrey's economy? Are we suffering more or less than other counties, in your view?
I think relatively we are suffering less. I think possibly because Surrey has a better cushion, perhaps materially than before we went into COVID. I think its overall output, its overall GVA still sees it doing fairly well. Equally, I think there's two cautions there. One, the complacency. Two, the fact that Surrey's going to be fine, that we saw pre-COVID, is a very real issue. It has produced stagnation, a lack of intersector cooperation, a failure to go out and find businesses, and a failure to prevent businesses from leaving the county. We have seen actual real hemorrhage of multinational corporations leaving the county. Much of this may be attributed, I think, to some extent to Brexit, but to other areas, it's simply that they are finding better, cheaper areas in which to work. And even if it may not be green and leafy Surrey, they're prepared to take that on the chin. So, that's an issue.
But you will have seen, no doubt, because I'm sure you read the Guildford Dragon every day, that,
Naturally.
that the council is warning us all that they have a real problem financially to balance the budget, and
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
we must expect to be some difficult choices, and
Yeah.
the things that they don't have to provide, the non-statutory services, are likely to be in those difficult decisions, and will affect our the amount of amenity we can enjoy.
Certainly, I think just because Surrey has been perhaps slightly economically above the level playing field pre-COVID doesn't mean it hasn't suffered a very real bruise as a result of COVID. In many senses, I think we've seen a contraction of somewhere between 15 and 25%. And although we had seen a recovery post the summer briefly, I think the second lockdown might actually hit harder than the first one. Obviously, Surrey County Council has been under enormous constraints. It too was hit by the austerity budgets of the last 10 years and had to make swinging cuts, particularly to non-statutory areas. It's now going to be under the most ferocious amount of pressure. The government may be doling out bits and pieces, but it's simply not going to be enough. It is going to require cuts. I think we make very clear in the report that difficult decisions have to be made. And for that reason, actually, the urging of the report is, for God's sake, let's work together. The collective aspect, that collective community dynamic, is the only thing that's going to pull Surrey out. We cannot simply say, well, the county council or the growth board or the commission will pull us out of it. First of all, I don't think that's what we want. I don't think unilateral sort of leadership in that sense is actually what's going to be wanted. In fact, if anything, the vast majority of people we spoke to said, I want to be included in the decision making. Please include me. I want to work with my LEP. I want to work with my district, my borough, with county council. I'm going to get on the skills board. I'm going to get on the enterprise board. So there's a real thirst, Martin, at this point. There's a very real desire, I think, to get on board, but possibly slightly lack of clarity as to what that structure is. Now, that's down to Surrey County Council to be able to provide that. But as a university, we can provide a forum for being able to facilitate that. And I think we can give policy guidance. I don't think we can make policy, but we can certainly show the pros and cons in an objective, evidence-based way.
Professor Amelia Hadfield, thank you very much for giving your time, and I hope you'll come and speak again to the Guildford Dragon in future.
I love the Guildford Dragon, especially my mug.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you for everything.